doctors need to focus on the business side of things of their practice, not just the clinical.
It's a dirty word when you start talking about profitability in the practice. But how do you sustain a practice if it's not profitable?
You've got to have a vision for your practice. Business doesn't love you back. Payroll tax is a political football. Have a reset. Take a weekend off. Calm yourself down. Think. Go through to evaluation. Understand where you are. Don't ever sign a personal guarantee on a property lease. You are personally liable for that. Buy your own building. Don't worry about attracting patients. Attract the doctors.
Where should we start? Welcome everyone to another episode of MedCenters TV. Today we have a very, very special guest and someone who has been a good mate for the last 15 to 20 years. Today we welcome Paul Copeland. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Dion. Great to be here.
For those of you who don't know who Paul is a partner with William Buck. He's a chartered accountant, and he's an accountant who specializes in providing business advice and taxation advice to the medical industry at large. And today we want to talk about some relevant topics relevant to doctors, GPs, in general, specialists, and all stakeholders in the medical industry. I think we're going to have a feast of information today, and we're really, really privileged to have Paul with us. Well, Paul, where do we start? Tell us a bit about yourself. How did you start in the industry?
I started as an accountant about 30 years ago. So 30 years ago in last year. So 31 years this year. And so I started off, and my area of specialisation, like medicine, there is specialisations within accounting. So I went into taxation, but also a lot of business planning, business advice. And so that's where I was trained up initially. After about 6 years of doing that, I had become a chartered accountant. And then I just had a total brain meltdown, left the industry, and went off and bought two business franchises. And they were an absolute financial disaster. I then ended up having a half share in a pub. I built some childcare centres and ran childcare centres, but I always knew I would end up coming back to accounting, which I did. And when I came back to accounting, I had learned an awful lot about business. So up until leaving the profession, I'd always worked on theory. But having gone out into the real world, I got some real chunky real world experience where things had worked for me, things hadn't worked for me. And you learn an awful lot from getting out from behind your desk and getting into that real world space. And when I came back, I thought about what I wanted from an accountant and what my clients would want from an accountant. And the doing of a tax return and putting together financials statements is just one element of it. What people were, I think, going to really need more was going to be that advisory side of things. And at that point in time, GST was coming in. We were moving as an industry away from people writing up their big green old cash books where they'd write them out, and moving into bookkeeping where you were using something like MyOb or Xero, QuickBooks as well. And so I could see this happening, and as the industry would evolve, the need for more advice would come through. And so thinking about it, and this is as a reasonably junior accountant in the scheme of things, I was also thinking, well, how do you get that advice? Because like any business, you can invest only so much of your time in learning something about an industry, for example, if you have a number of clients in there, but all your other clients are in other industries. So you could spend months learning about the medical industry and know everything about it, but if you can only apply that knowledge to 3 or 4 clients, how's that really of value to me? And so you have to think of both sides. And so to actually make that knowledge work, you've actually got to go through and position yourself as not only targeting these particular clients, but also then being able to offer them that advice. And so we started out by approaching the AMA. We spoke to AMA Queensland, where we came in contact with yourself. And we also have, over a long period of time, developed really good relationships with the College of General Practitioners, who we work closely with. We've worked with all the major banks, legal firms, industry providers, software providers. Pretty much over the next 25 years, we have positioned ourselves as being the industry leaders. And I think it's reasonable to say that William Buck is seen now as the leading national firm in the health space. And I'm proud to head up our national health team. And so that's been a big accomplishment for us. And we are now constantly working to hone our skills, because we realise as well that once we have essentially, we feel, get to the top of an industry, everyone else wants to be there as well. So we can't just rest on our laurels. So we're constantly trying to grow.
Well, that's the thing that we used to have conversations, etc. In the past, is that you not only are an accountant, but you've had the experiences. You've had those commercial entities, be it in those franchises that you've had, having half a share in the pub, also dabbling in real estate.
A lot of property development. So I've got 2 areas of specialisation, which is property and medical. And in the property space, I've got clients there as well. And that does serve my medical clients really well, because there is that trend towards building your medical centres, developing a medical centre, or owning your own building and knowing how that works too.
For me, that was the most rounded thing about yourself, is that not only did you have the accounting experience from accounting, being a chartered accountant, but you knew the industry. And over 25 years, when we talk about the industry, knowing the different organizations, knowing, for example, Department of Health and Aging, immigration, the college, all these different organizations that affect hugely the growth of a practice, or the stuff that's going to affect regulation, for example. Like, people don't understand the effect of having a DPA, what that means, how that can affect the profitability of practice, or location, or leases, or the cost of space, the setup of a practice. And, you have all that knowledge, and you have dealt with so many GPs over the years. And I know personally, I have come to you many times. So whenever I talk about the industry, I get excited. But it's moved on from back in the early 2000s, where there wasn't as many practices around. Yes, we had a huge shortage of GPs, but general practice itself, you had a lot more bulk billing practices. You had a lot more GPs then. They were just bulk billing, seeing the 30, 40 patients a day on the hamster wheel. And then, when it came to taxes and you talk about strategic planning and stuff like that, well, that was the last thing on their minds. It was go to work, you work from 8 to 7 or whatever it was, you're on the hamster wheel, you burn out, or you get to the end of your tether, you got to practice maybe 3, 4, 5 GPs, and then you get to the end and you want to sell this because you worked so hard for so long, and then you get to selling it, and then what you think it was going to be worth is not what it's worth, and we'll come back to that. But what have you seen from the GP that entered the industry then, as compared to the GP that enters the industry now? Is there any kind of profile or changes that you see?
The profile of our GP has definitely changed. So you don't have to be an industry expert to see how the industry has changed over, say, the last 20, 25 years. We've gone from almost a cottage industry where you had 1, 2 doctor practices to now big medical centres like the one we're sitting in, where it's not economical for a doctor to be a solo practitioner or even have 2 other doctors working for them. The nature of a practice is that you need to have at least probably 4 or 5 FTE doctors to turn a profit. If you're a doctor opening up a practice on your own, historically, going back 25 years, it wasn't uncommon to have Dr. X working from a small shop or even their home or a little house they've converted, and they'd have maybe a receptionist, maybe a nurse, which might be their spouse, and they could make a good living for themselves. That doesn't work like that anymore. And it's not just GPs we can't find, it's trained staff we can't find either.
So true.
And so if you want to get nurses, you've got a lot of competition coming from the hospitals, particularly in the regional areas. If you want to get administration staff, and people think we can just put someone in for that administration role, they need training. They need to know how to deal with people. They need to know how to deal with the software. And so finding those staff is just as tricky. And a lot of that sort of work we delegate off to our practice manager. But to get back to your point, we've gone from being a cottage industry to a much more sophisticated business industry. You're seeing large corporates who own a lot of medical practices, and the next level down, you're seeing the mini corporates more and more aggressively, actively buying up practices to put themselves into a position where it is a strong financial position. You're getting a trend of doctor owners, I think, and we'll talk about this later, but the payroll tax issue has really brought to the forefront how doctors need to focus on the business side of things in their practice, not just the clinical. The doctors that have got themselves into a muddle with payroll tax are really, as a result of focusing on the clinical and delegating this off to perhaps their advisors, perhaps their practice manager, and thinking that this is being sorted out. But it hasn't been.
It hasn't been. And so, you mentioned something there when we talk about staff. You mentioned, for example, like administrative staff or nursing staff. It's as simple as knowing the software, but the software itself may play such a big part. So, there's this misconception, okay, we'll just hire any administrative staff and we'll hire any nurse. But, there's nurses that specialize in general practice. There's reception staff that understands Medicare, that understands the software, and to train and get those skill stuff, it's like hen's teeth these days.
Well, the operation side of things is just one element, and this what we were talking about before about planning for your practice. You've got to have a vision for your practice, and we'll sit there and go, oh, you can use best practice. Oh, you've got your pulse and your breathing, you're in. But then we've got to sit there and say, well, what is our vision for our practice? Because you can have someone who's a totally toxic individual sitting on your reception. And when we think about a practice as a practice owner, doctors will tend to sit there and think, I'm a good doctor, patients are coming in to see me, I've done a good job.
Well, they're not a reception for 8 or 9 hours a day.
Your receptionist is a horrible person, and they might be nice as pie to you, but they're horrible to your maybe other team members or maybe to your patients. And then it's also how we look at our staff, because a big thing that we don't talk enough about, we've seen after COVID an escalation in the aggressiveness of patients and the entitled nature as we move away from bulk billing to private billing, mixed billing. The patients are getting more and more aggressive, and in a lot of cases, their anger and frustration is being directed at our staff. And a big thing that we don't talk about enough is that we as practice owners or directors of the company, employers, we've got a statutory responsibility to keep our staff safe.
So true.
And so we're actually seeing now a lot of work in the space of how we teach our staff to deal with de-escalation, how we teach our staff to deal with aggressive patients so that they are safe. And putting that in place, there's online courses, there's in-training courses. Not a lot of people that do it. But that sort of, I think, course is really valuable to not only keep our staff safe, but also demonstrates how you are wanting to set the tone for your relationship with your staff. And it gives them the idea that, hey, they actually care about me, which can be a massive point of difference. It's like when we think about our staff, the first thing we always think about is pay. I'll pay them more and they'll be happy. But the nature of our industry is it doesn't attract people that are necessarily always motivated by money. You've got so many people out there that are motivated by caring and trying to help people. And that's why people go into the health profession. If you wanted to be making a fortune, you wouldn't be a GP. You'd be an orthopedic surgeon or an ophthalmologist.
A lot of people don't understand this, Paul. So I'll stop you there because I want to go back. And there's so much we can go through. It's, back in the day, first you had these cottage practices, pre-2000, etc., right? And then we started moving into these commercial developments with obviously population explosion, or would you say population growth, etc., especially in Queensland. And then you had Woolies and Coles moving in. And so it was the old 2,000, 2,500 square meter to 3,000 Woolies box, 15, 16 retailers with a dedicated pharmacy and a medical center. Medical centers then were anything from 150 to 220 square meters, right? Which was then anything from a 4-doctor to a 6-doctor practice, right? And then we started to get the the kind of new breed of GP that was coming into it, because now these spaces came at a cost. So, and they wanted securities up front, they wanted guarantees up front, and you really then needed to have some sort of capital backing or some sort of financial acumen. You had to negotiate for your lease, you had to have a business plan, you had to set your practice out correctly, because you were setting your practice out not just for the term of 3 or 4 years, but for future growth. And I saw a lot of problems in that itself. Some practices where you set up for a very small waiting room and you got 7, 8 consulting rooms, but there was capacity issues, there was patient flow issues, but there was no real education or no handbook or no one that GPs could get advice from. They just used and applied what they thought was it. And then it obviously came back to bite them on the bum, so to speak. But when we move away from that, from the early 2000s to now, if you look at the amount of practices that have opened in any geographical area per capita, it's just been an explosion of medical centers. But they're still fighting for the same stakeholder of patients and doctors. We still don't have enough doctors, but medical centers competing for that one patient. And we still don't have enough skilled staff. We still don't have enough acumen, etc., for setting up our practices, but also for the ongoing management of practices and bringing them to profitability. So we come back to, where should we start if you are a GP wanting or in love with this idea that I want to own my own practice? Where should we start?
As a GP, most GPs are members of the college, Royal College of General Practitioners Australia. Go there. They have a lot of education, a lot of online information about where to start. A big mistake is that we tend to go off and go to our friends, our colleagues. So, which is good to get some of their insights and talk about their challenges, but getting the real advice from industry professionals. So as a doctor, if you're talking to Dr. X, who set up their practice 20 years ago, it's a totally different scenario than it is today. The numbers are totally different. The laws are totally different. The taxation's different. The HR is different. Everything is different to what they're aware of or may have experienced when they set up their one practice. It's then going through and saying, are you prepared for the stress? And a lot of doctors just aren't. They're not prepared for the stress that comes with running the practice. And so that's why we're seeing the growth in these mini corporates. The mini corporates, some of them have got models where they'll partner up with doctors and say, look, we'll look after the administration, you look after the clinical. And that's quite an attractive option to many of them. And so you've got that there. But I would go and educate myself on business. I'd go and educate myself on the setup. So you've got online webinars, you've got college webinars, you've got ourselves, we do them as well. There are also other industry, well-known accounting firms out there, and they're good. So it doesn't just have to be William Buck. But my advice would be is if you're not talking to a really well-known accounting brand out there in the health space, not known as an accounting brand, but known in the health space, you probably should in this situation. And then talk to a legal firm that's known in the health space. Talk to the banks that are known in the health space. Because otherwise, as an accountant, I can tell you, when we see a doctor come in and say, I want to set up a practice, that's great, good. We see this is good, we can help. But if you're a generalist accountant, you haven't gone through this and you don't have this information, you don't have this knowledge. And again, like I was saying, the whole payroll tax thing, the things that we've learnt over the last 4 or 5 years has been people that try to give us knowledge when they don't know all of our industry can cause us an awful lot of damage. And so when you're setting up your practice, get the right advice, invest in the education. You've got places like Scale My Clinic, for example. They'll do courses online and they'll help people setting up practice. Talk to them. And it will cost you money. But that money is nothing. Oh, it's nothing compared to what you'll lose if you make terrible mistakes. And you can come and have conversations with a variety of individuals and build that knowledge about what works best for you. But another starting point is to say, well, what sort of practice do I want to create? I want to have a general practice. Okay, well, what's your point of difference? As you were saying, we're fighting for the same patients, we're fighting for the same doctors. Patients, to me, from the metrics and the numbers we look at, are not as hard to get if you position your practice nicely as it is for the doctors. But if you don't have patients coming, you won't get the doctors. And it is a big catch-22 in that I'm talking to one of my clients at the moment who's going through this growth phase. They put on 2 doctors because they could get 2 doctors, but they couldn't fill them quickly enough. And so the patients started to come, but the doctors got restless because they're not earning. And so then they go, well, this is not working, we're off. And so they didn't actually, and you can't blame the doctors, you can't blame the practice owner. But you also sit there and say, well, if I was a doctor and I hung in there for another couple of months, you'd be flying. But as the practice owner, you can say, well, if you market it harder, but they're marketing as hard as they can. And the patients come, and now you're sitting there saying, right, the same practice is going back to the drawing board where they've got to now hire one doctor this time and bring them through and grow them.
But this is a thing that's happening every day in every practice, in most practices, right? Because there's 2 issues. One, if you already set up a practice, and all of a sudden you've had, for whatever reason, a couple of GPs leave, and it's so competitive, so you're reliant on a couple of things for recruitment. Either recruitment companies that come at an absolute fortune, right? At a time where your practice, your leg's been chopped, and now you're struggling to attract doctors. All of a sudden, you get introduced to 2 doctors that come at a cost, at a huge cost. So you got to pay those fees, and then you got to give your doctor your retainer, and then you got to build up that patient base again. Then it's that catch-22. How do I keep them? Because the doctor's concentrating on themselves. You know, what's their building going to be, their future, etc. And so these are the things that you're not equipped for before. And how do you set yourself apart? Of course, there's social media, which there wasn't back in the day. So people are active on social media. And then you ask yourself, what do recruitment companies actually do? All they do is they make an introduction.
Yeah, the recruitment companies, I think the good ones will try and help them in. They'll help with the agreements. They'll smooth the way and be an advocate for your practice, which is, I think, positive. But the we work obviously with a lot of recruitment companies and both in education and also advisory work. One thing that we tend to focus on is this is the percentage you're going to be paid. This is the location they're going to be. But it's also, we need to start talking a lot more about what sort of medicine do you want to practice, what sort of patients you want to focus on, but also using metrics of this is what our practice does. So you've got Cubico out there, which is a well-known software. It's in probably 1 in 6 practices now, and growing. And so it's a great tool for marketing your practice in that we're using it now with our clients to look at what if analysis. So it sounds, boring, but you go through and say, in an average practice, you might have 2 owners and then 5 other doctors working for us. Let's look at what our owners bill. Let's look at how many patients they see an hour. Sorry,
Paul, for those out there that don't understand what Cubico does, can you just briefly tell us what does that software actually do?
Cubico is a add-on to your practice software that gives you data analytics on the operation of your practice. So it will tell you things like average patient fees by doctor, how many patients they're seeing, but it also, more importantly, will go through and unlock billing opportunities. So those of you who don't know Cubico, go Google it, look at some of the videos online. It's really good. I don't have shares in Cubico. But it's a great tool, we think, for looking at efficiencies, because we focus in our discussions on the percentage, like I was saying. But when we were at the owner-doctor conference this year in Cairns, we were talking to them and they're saying, well, as an average hourly rate, our doctors are billing about $370 an hour. Cubico will tell you what your doctors are billing in your practice. So it's some of our practices, the doctors are billing $500 an hour.
You see, but I'd like to talk about that part because for every doctor, it's different. Some doctors would feel, billing $200 or $250 an hour is great, where some doctors can bill up to $500 an hour, but it's based on how they're billing. It's based on the assistants they have, the systems they have, good nursing aid, they've got allied health inside, all those different factors, right? Okay, so, and it's a dirty word when you start talking about profitability in the practice. But how do you sustain a practice if it's not profitable? And, and patients and doctors sometimes don't want to hear about it. But for a practice to be sustained, to be sustainable, it's also based on income and profitability.
But this is where we've got to look at it. This, I call it coaching our doctors. So as a business owner, you've also got to be the coach of your team. So you've got to go through and look at your team, and you'll know within your team of GPs, if you've got a big practice, say, you've got some that are there for, let's call it lifestyle reasons. Right. I'm happy to work 9 till 2 and work those hours. I'm happy to work 3 days a week and then go surfing another couple of days a week. I inherited,
Lots of those doctors
money's not a big deal, right? Those sort of things. But then you've got the other doctors where okay, you've got a family, you've got kids to put through school. Life costs money, and in a economy where things aren't going down, things are going up. Going through and coaching our doctors on ways to increase their take-home pay is not a bad thing. And it's obviously having the discussion to go through, and the way you pitch it, it's not about going through and saying, hey, you have to do this. It's, hey, do you realise that if you went from seeing 3.7 patients an hour to 4 patients an hour, a small change, if you increased and you went from billing $72 an hour a patient to $95 a patient, this is what your actual take-home pay would be different over this fortnight. And we do that now using Cubico and our internal metrics. We then go through and say to them, hey, have a look at this. Is this something that you would, not us, but the practice owner, is this something you'd like to see? Yeah, I'd love to learn how to do that or see how that could be done, because they have to go home and pay their rent or pay their mortgage, pay their car, put groceries.
Well, Paul, what about the practice owner? If you're working, and this is the thing, at the end of the day, the buck stops at you. You can have 7 GPs in the practice and 2 GPs just working 3 days a week, 9 to 2, or 4 days, blah, blah, blah. And then you have your weekends. But we only have 2 GPs that want to do the weekends and carry the can. And then that leaves them susceptible to burnout. And there's also the other GPs of the past, 35, 40, 45 patients a day, just working 8 to 7, et cetera, with none of this knowledge or don't want to hear about it.
They say they don't want to hear about it until you start talking to them about it.
Until you start having conversations. So what is that business advice then that you give to GPs?
One thing we do is start off with a benchmark. So we gather our data from our practices as William Buck from around Australia, and it's literally hundreds of practices now that we look after, and we put it in a great big spreadsheet and we benchmark. And I was looking at some benchmarks that came to a new client from me the other day, and the benchmarks were reasonable, but in other areas they were quite wrong, because they're taking it from general industry data that is out there for everybody, and it's not put through a sieve, as it were, to take out the ones that are the outliers and making sure the data is correct. And so we can then go through and talk to a practice initially and do a benchmark on their practice for $300, $350. And it gives you that information straight away. So you can say, are my wages under control? Are my medical supplies under control? Are my payments to the doctors within the benchmarks? What about my other expenses? And it just starts that thinking process of, okay, am I doing things, call it the right way or the most efficient way? An example I just went through was with one of my more larger groups. Their wages had slipped. The benchmark wage we'd like to have is around 19 to 20%. Their wages had slipped out to 22.5%, which when you sit there and think, well, it's not a big deal. It is. When you look at they're turning over a lot of money. And so the data we do is always based on gross patient fees. And I had a conversation with them. We put in place over a 6-month period some incentives for the practice managers. The practice managers initially started off going, we can't make it any better. We then threw them some bones. We put in place an incentive type program, which was based on not only throwing them a financial bone, but also psychologically giving them the tools, giving them some training to support them through. The difference they were able to achieve over a 6-month period resulted in a net dollar amount of about $476,000 in additional profit to that group, massive in 6 months. And it's like, imagine if they hadn't addressed this. And that was brought pure, and it sounds as though we're skiting a bit, but it was something that we brought to their attention. There's other practices that have come to us through the referrals and doing the courses we do and the training we do, wages up to 30%. And we're saying this is where all your profit's going, because a typical GP practice is running on about 11% to 12% gross profit based on gross patient fees. So that takes into account the rent you've got coming in from pathology, takes into account your incentives, which push you up, and then all your costs bring you down. So that's a starting point. It's cheap to get a benchmark done. And when you put an offer out there to people, say, let's do a benchmark, $300, $350, we get inundated with practices wanting to get it done. But then they'll go back to their practice, and the big thing is they don't change. That doesn't happen. Because straight away, they don't change their own mindset. They'll go in on Monday and they're swamped with patients. I'll get to that. I'll get to that. I'll get to that. I'll put it aside. And what I was meant to do something. I've got to do that.
2 years down the line.
100%. 2 years down the line. I had a doctor come in the other day. I saw you, Paul, 7 years ago. And I had my meeting. I've gone off and done this. I've done that. I need to come back to you. I'm sorry, And he says, I'm sorry. And it's like, you don't need to be sorry, mate.
It's your practice. It's your practice. So, Paul, tell me, what if, and I know there are a lot of practices like this out there, and should I say practice owners out there, stable practices where I'm talking about stability, they've been around for a while, right? And you forget how fast, for example, time goes and you're in a lease situation. Sometimes you're coming to the end of your lease. Maybe you don't have another option, but then you've leveraged to the hill and you don't have enough time, and you're asking yourself, and you're tired because you've been on the hamster wheel over a period of time, going through all the motions of losing doctors, getting more doctors, losing patients, and all the day-to-day operations that happen in general practice, which can be very, very stressful, which the man on the street doesn't see, or generally doctors just working for themselves in the practice. What advice would you give to that person?
Okay, so where do we start? What advice to give that person? Take a break. Although it's so difficult, if you're getting burnt out and if you're on the hamster wheel, you are the leader of your practice. You're the captain of the ship. Everybody looks to you for that leadership. Now, when we talk about leadership, immediately we go, I have to lead the way, I have to be out front. You don't. You've got a team of people. If you've got a good team of people, motivate them, encourage them on where to go. But they don't know where to go if you don't tell them. And so you've got to look at yourself first. The way that you operate is the problem. And so it's a horrible thing to say and a hard thing to say, because people sit there and say, you don't know what you're talking about. I take you back to what I said in my opening comments. I've been in a business where we weren't making money and I was sinking below the water. And a colleague of mine came up to me at that point and said, the business. And I said, I love the business. And he says, the business doesn't love you back. And that was
so true. I like that. The business doesn't love you back.
The business doesn't love you back. It's a one-way relationship.
One-way relationship.
And so it was a trigger for me that still sticks in my head probably 25, 30 years later, where you sit there and say, you have to look after yourself first. And if you are suffering with your health, with your stress, how many times we hear about doctors falling over dead in their practice because they've worked themselves to their 80 and they've never stopped. And I was reading an article the other day, I think it was on the Facebook or one of the college things, doctor in his town having to work into his 70s because there's no doctor to take over the practice. Yes, that's great. It's very altruistic, but you've got to at some point look after yourself. But back to the point of the business side of things. Have a reset. Take a weekend off. Calm yourself down. Think. Have a conversation with your partner, your family. Where are we going?
And then speak to your accountant.
If your accountant is an industry advisor, or have a conversation with your colleagues, your friends, and so on, saying, this is how I'm feeling. And maybe it's time to reassess. And then go through and do a full check on your practice. The benchmarking. Look at how your system's operating. Look at what's online for proper education. We're talking about education. Well, education from industry, there's plenty of people out there that like to call themselves medical industry advisors. We'll talk to you about all sorts of different things, right? And if they start off by saying, this is how we're going to deal with your tax and how I'm going to save you tax, flick to the next one. Do yourself a favour. Then go and talk to the people and say, well, who are the ones the college puts up? Who are the ones that are talking with industry, big companies? Talk to them. But then go through and say, right, maybe I need a plan. I need a personal plan. I need a financial plan. I need a strategic business plan for my practice. Where am I going to go to? You could be in your 50s, you could be in your 60s, you could be in your 40s. It's never a bad time to have a bit of a plan and a reset, because that will make your life easier. And if you can look at the financial side of your practice, which allows you to employ, if you improve your profitability, you can have a good practice manager. If you improve your profitability, you can sell it out to some other doctors in the practice to take some of that clinical burden off you. There's all these options. And another big thing is, don't assume that what you were doing 10 years ago is still the best way to do it today. Things change.
I mean, so much has changed. Coming to change, Queensland is massive. And regional areas are growing at a rate of knots, and largely because of interest rates, because of cost of land, cost of building, all this.
Some regional areas.
But the biggest thing is doctors that have come to the end of their lifespan in terms of working life, of closing the doors and walking out. They're just tired. And so it's a challenge getting doctors out there. It's a challenge. And what I still find, though, is developers and stuff like that, they still don't give you any relief to. They're still asking you for your pound of flesh for the cost of space.
So we're talking about, developers, regions,
Yep.
property.
And attracting doctors out
So let's
there.
talk about the regions. The regions in Queensland are mainly DPA areas. In Australia, there's a lot more DPA space across the board.
Sorry, Paul, if you want to qualify what DPA is to the normal person that's watching this.
It's a priority workforce area. So doctors from overseas can come in. They'll have a 10-year moratorium where they can work within the practice. There's different levels that are requiring where they're coming from and their training they've had. They will require supervision, but where the doctor is coming from will depend on that level of supervision. And different areas will be able to bring in doctors under different qualifications. But the big thing there is understanding there will be a cost, but there's a cost in not doing it. And bringing these doctors in, the college is working very closely with the government to bring in a lot more doctors coming from overseas and encourage practice owners to look at what's going on throughout Australia and the opportunities that are going to be there. But when you're going through as a practice owner and you're thinking, okay, you need to assess as part of this planning process, when do I want to stop? And stopping doesn't necessarily have to equate with practice ownership change, or because if you want to stop working and put your feet up and say, look, I'm done as a doctor, then that will probably mean it will be 3 to 4 years after you sell your practice.
That's right.
If you want to get the most for your practice sale, then any buyer, I think, is really going to say, we want you to stay for at least a couple of years, up to 4, working in the practice to ensure that smooth transition and stability. Because no matter how big or small you are as a practice owner, it's still hard to get doctors.
It's fascinating. You have this issue of regional areas trying to attract doctors. And then you have areas like metropolitan areas with beautiful practices that's, physically set up, but can't get doctors. So how do you attract doctors in that scenario?
We have to have the discussion about money. So I've talked to the colleges about this and said for a long time, GPs were doing well financially. You look at some of our older GP practice owners, they own their practices, they have investment properties, they have rental properties and so on. They've got large superannuation balances. They've made that money, I think, in a lot of ways historically. Our new GP practitioners are not making as much when you look at their colleagues anywhere near as much. So a GP practice, a doctor, if they're billing $400,000 a year, say they're taking home most 70%, it's $280,000 a year. $280,000 a year, less tax, then there's not an awful lot there when you're comparing it with some of their medical colleagues. And the doctors have actually worked this out, because you look at the cohort of graduating medical students, it's gone from maybe 50% of them went into general practice, now down as low as reporting 12%.
Really?
That's it.
That's phenomenal.
That's what it is,
It's
because
astounding.
these doctors and the
12%.
kids that are graduating through are looking at it and saying, well, I've done all this study. I'm coming out with a $200,000, $300,000 help debt. I can't afford to buy a house if I'm making 280 grand a year. I can't afford to buy the car I want to buy. I can't keep up with my colleagues. And so that's, in a lot of ways, it's a secret within the medical profession, I think, because they still want to make the right noises. We don't talk to doctors about money. We talk to doctors about caring for patients and giving back and being part of the community and so on, which, again, we don't want to stop that. But if we want to arrest the decline in GPs, we want to address the money side of things, which is why the federal government 2 budgets ago tripled the bulk billing incentive. It's why there is this move towards private billing and the move away from bulk billing, because doctors of GPs in particular are finally saying, well, enough's enough. We need to make a living too.
But then, that's another conversation. They triple the bulk billing incentive, but where have they put the money, towards
Certain areas.
certain areas?
Yeah.
Those areas don't really affect.
We can't, and I guess you start talking about bulk billing and then lead into payroll tax. It is a political issue where the government, the federal government, makes an awful lot of mileage about bulk billing rates. And they still want to tell people about how much is bulk billing, and they see that as a success for the federal government. But we all know it's becoming less and less prevalent in private practice, GP land, that bulk billing is the norm because our doctors can't afford it.
Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to talk about here, right? So we'll just firstly stay on general practice, and then we'll move into other areas. So in terms of general practice itself, I think a little bit of education for the budding GP or the younger GP or the GP that is in love with owning their own practice and says, look, I'm going to now venture out, right? Okay, one of the fundamental things I think is to understand when you are opening a medical center or a practice, what it takes to be profitable. That means after you set up and if you've done your due diligence and everything else, that you're not profitable with one GP or you're not profitable with two GPs. When is it that you actually become profitable? At what point?
That is a constantly shifting finish line. So what we find now is you're setting up a practice. One is what are you paying for your rents?
It's a huge factor.
Your rents are going to be massively skewed. What you need to do is understand that in a shopping centre situation or a development situation, you as a GP practice owner bring an awful lot of value. Once you're in there as a GP practice and you have a couple of doctors that were going in, it will encourage other tenants to join the shopping centre, which is why shopping centres like general practice in there.
Anchor tenants.
Anchor tenants. So you need to know your value. So you negotiate hard. Then you go back and say, okay, what is my rent? Then you're going to go through and say, well, we need to get a pathology rent in there. The pathology will come in and offer you potentially a small amount, a large amount, short-term leases. After a couple of years, that rent may come down, it might go up. A lot of that will depend on the success of your practice. So you may be paying a certain amount of rent and go through, well, that's going to be offset a lot by my pathology rent. But within 2 years' time, you're in a muddle.
Yeah, that's doctors leave, all those sorts of things.
Look at your leases and the security they're going to ask for. In a lot of cases, I will recommend strongly to my clients that you offer a higher bank guarantee in the lease as opposed to any sort of personal guarantee. Don't ever sign a personal guarantee on a property lease, because that means for the entire term of that lease, you are personally liable for that. So that can add a whole new level of cost if things don't work out. Then you go through and say, okay, I've got my lease, I've got my pathology in there, my fit out. Your fit out costs have gone through the roof. You're paying thousands of dollars a square metre now for your fit out.
So what's it now? Is it around $2,000, $3,000 a square metre?
$2,000 to $3,000 a square metre. It used to be about $1,200.
So that means if you got some, back in the day it was $1,000. So now if you're setting up a practice, say around 300 to 400 square meters, so that's already set you back over $1 million.
Almost $1 million. But then you might have some incentive come from your landlord. But
if you're negotiating hard.
But remember, that money coming in could be taxable. If they give you the incentive.
Because it's tax as income.
Tax as income. And so you won't have a corresponding deduction. And so you could lose a lot of that incentive
But we don't think about that at the time.
No,
You go,
because you
oh, I
don't.
got the great incentive.
I've got $400,000 from my landlord. I got $200,000 from my landlord. This is great. Then you don't feel as though I could
Until you do
lose.
your first tax return, right?
And then you lose a lot of it in tax. And then your business structure will come into play. If you're trading as a lease, if you're trading, as a trust, or as a company, all of that will come into play. Then you've got to go through and say, right, I've set up this larger space. I've got my room set up and I've managed to find a way to do it. Then you've got to attract your patients. Patients you won't fill from day one. You've got to have a marketing plan. You've got to have something that differentiates yourself. And you as a clinician will be, or as a practitioner, will go through and say, okay, the pressure on me financially is massive. I'm going to be pedaling so hard to make this work. I'm going to rely on me. And this is where our mindset is. How do we make more money? I work harder.
That's right.
I work harder. That's what I've been trained
And
from
most
day
of the
one.
time, it's just sucking in these big ones because after you first go through that whole fall in love situation, there's nobody else now because you got to pay the bills.
Exactly. But then you're not actually spending enough time building the business. You're relying on someone else to do that. And if your practice manager can be recruiting people in and you've got other doctors that might join you over a period of time, there's going to be an extended period where you're going to be running at a loss. You might not be bringing any money in to your house.
Let's look at that scenario, right, Paul? 300 to 400 square meter practice, which is predominantly what, a 7, 8 doctor, 10 doctor practice, right? So it looks beautiful because you spend all this money setting it up. But now besides your capital cost is up to 1.2, 1.3 mil, around there, if it's set up for that amount of money. You could have borrowed 50%, 100%, 80%.
100%. Most people buy 100.
100%. So you're already down 1.2, 1 mil. Then you got your working capital, right? So you need at least half a mil or 300,000.
Well, your pips and your whips don't arrive from day one.
No.
Your patient fees start to arrive, but you've got staff wages from day one. Your rent has to be paid. Your loan has to be paid. Everything has to be paid. But this is just in the business. This is a whole lot of new costs.
But you already set back close to $1.5 million before you did anything.
It's a big hole to dig yourself out of. And that's why I'm saying to my clients, don't set up. I think it's too expensive. Look at opportunities that are out there for smaller practices where you can amalgamate, create a bigger one, or buy your own building. If you're going to invest that much money, buy your own building. The banks will lend you to buy your own building and take, if you're in for a penny, in for a pound. But it's having that plan. And none of what we've said today should be taken as advice. It's got to be totally disclaimed. And get the advice, come and see a professional advisor about what you've done so that what you put in place is good for you and your specific circumstances.
Okay, so that some of the stuff about general practice. Okay, let's continue general practice and get to the end of this aspect. So now with general practice, you've got the issues of attracting patients. You've got the issues of attracting doctors, which we went through. Some kind of advice, or would I say, what would you say in terms of strategic planning regarding attracting patients and attracting doctors that you give advice about?
My first thing is don't worry about attracting patients, attract the doctors. If you've got general marketing out there, will get patients coming to you. But you have patients coming to you, it's great, but if you don't have doctors, it's not so great. So as you get doctors that are coming to join your practice, find out what maybe their special interests are and then market to that, and people will travel. I'm interested in asthma. I'm interested in high blood pressure. I'm interested in skin or whatever I'm interested in. Obesity, stress, all these sort of things. Ideally, try and align it with a care plan. Bring them through and then target your marketing to that into specific groups. Then go through and show your doctors that are coming through that the industry average is $360, $370 an hour. Our practice bill is $450. This is the difference, which then changes the conversation from percentage. We pay 70%. Well, the guy down the road pays 70%. That's great. You'll make $300 an hour there. Here you'll make $500 an hour. And we charge you $65. Go pay 70 down there. We charge you get 70% here, 65. You know what I'm saying?
But it's the actual dollars that you get.
Dollars you get in your hand.
Yep.
And that is what is not discussed enough. And that's where the doctors need to become more financially savvy.
All right, then, there's two aspects. There's the aspect of setting up, and then there's the aspect of making your practice profitable and getting to that doctor full-time equivalent that's going to do that and the stability of the practice. What about when you go to sell your practice and valuations of practices?
There's so many different models about how you start to
What is
exit.
that formula, Paul?
Well, it's based on future maintainable earnings, which is it's a calculation based on profit, but not just what you made last year, it's what your future profit is. So the fact that you made $500,000 last year, showing as your profit, but you got a $100,000 PHN grant and you had 4 doctors working for you that have now all left. Next year, you're going forward, there won't be a grant and you won't have those 4 doctors. You don't have any chance on the horizon of getting 4, you might get 1. Your position and your profit going forward is totally different. So that's why it's a future maintainable earnings calculation. Then there's the risk factor. Doctors will go through and say, well, my mate sold his practice for 3, 4, 5 times a practice. Normally at the moment it's about 4-ish, maybe a bit less. And I should get that. That doesn't make any sense from a financial point of view. It's a good as a starting point, understanding what your practice is worth. If you're getting to a point where you want to start talking about succession, and it doesn't have to be a practice sale, it can be a part sale, it can be a restructure. There can be so many opportunities. We do this an awful lot now where somebody who started their practice 15 years ago has now created a practice that might be worth $2 million. And they've got all this value in this practice that they can't get at to do for investing. Whereas we now
And
go
there's
through
so many practices out there like that.
heaps. And so we go through and work with them to work out ways to unlock that equity, to save them tax, free up that equity, boost their superannuation and pay down personal debt and start afresh. And although they sit there and say, well, hey, I might be borrowing up, you're borrowing up to invest. You're borrowing up, you're taking money from the left hand and putting it in the right hand, saving tax, creating equity, building up a practice that might be a lot more attractive to incoming doctors as investors. That's a great strategy. Another strategy is to go through, do one of those, it's called practice resets, go through, do a valuation, understand where you are. We do valuations all the time. We're on all the bank panels for valuations. Cost about four and a half grand plus GST. And we'll give you an idea of the valuation, but also not just here's a piece of paper. It's an in-depth analysis of your practice.
What are you looking for, Paul, in terms of the risks?
The risks, we look at doctor turnover, we look at location, we look at fit out, we look at the age of the practitioners, we look at the mix of the doctors. A big thing people don't look at is, okay, well, I've got 3 registrar doctors in there. I'm making good coin, 4 registrars in there. But I've only got 2 supervisors and one of them's myself and the other one's my business partner. Nobody else wants to supervise them. If you sell out, who's going to do the supervision? And so that needs to be a discussion. It needs to be planned for. And again, my registrars who we pay, 50% to roughly, they've come through and they've all fell out and I kept them all. Okay, well, that's great. Now they all want 65%.
That's going to affect your bottom line.
It's going to affect your bottom line. And they're using up the rooms we were previously using for our registrars, so I've got nowhere to put anyone else. That's a problem.
Your leases?
The leases, we look at the term of the lease, we look at how much you're paying, we look at what your pathology's paying, we look at your staff turnover, your staff percentages going through. We look at what you're paying. IT costs can be ridiculously high. We look at what you're paying for marketing. We look at what you're paying across the board and go through then and say, and the location of the practice. We look at saying, okay, what is the picture? Part of evaluation process, if it's done in accordance with accounting standards, does require us to talk to the client prior to finalising to give them essentially a right of reply, to say this is what we've come up with, this is why we think it is. If you do this, this, and this, you can actually get a much higher valuation, and that is something you can use for planning. But also, you as the client can come back and say, well, I think this, this, and this, and sometimes we tweak it, a lot of times we don't. But it gets people involved with the process, and at least you come away understanding why your practice is worth what it is. We back that up with working closely with all the banks. We see what practices are selling for. We understand that there are outlier sales. Oh, they sold their practice for 6 times.
Is there a lot of practices out there at the moment?
There's a lot of practices that are not worth buying out there. There's a lot of practices that are talking to other people. A lot of practice sales are off market, which is why when we work with the banks, we actually see the ones that go through as call it the sneaky sales, that nobody knows, because we say, well, this practice is selling. The acquirer needs to get finance. That's where we come in. We help with that.
What about the scenario where you can buy something that is struggling and add value to it?
100%. That's good. That's what we call special value. So special value is something where you sit there and say, well, that practice is really worth 200 grand. But to me, it might be worth 300. And so you paying 300 is fine, but it doesn't set a value. That's the same way as somebody pays, here's a practice which is really large, and I want to get a foothold in this particular area. Or I'm a corporate. The corporates are going through and paying potentially higher amounts, in a lot of cases not. They structure their finance and their purchases in different ways. We'll pay you 4 times up front, 3 times up front, and we'll pay you the rest when we list.
Do doctor contracts come into that as well?
Doctors are normally on service agreements now, so the service agreements will come through. It's very difficult to actually get your doctors under a contract, particularly now with the payroll tax base.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned that. In the past, when you're valuing practices, the longer the doctor contracts, the longer the lease, et cetera, obviously it adds to increase valuation, right? But doctor contracts, like I always say, is just a piece of paper.
It was always a false sense of security.
That's
the doctors are always going to do what they want to do.
Correct.
And how do you get a doctor to abide by the contract? You have to take them to court in a worst case scenario.
Why do you want to go down that route?
Why do you want to go down that route? And doctor contracts have gone out the door with payroll tax. So the contracts that we now have in place are a lot looser. They're service agreements where the practice is now providing services to the doctor. In a lot of cases, doctors will be told, move away from being companies and trusts. You shouldn't be a company or trust anyway. It's a waste of money. It's an accounting revenue raising exercise. There's generally very, very little circumstances.
Are you talking about the working
the individual
doctor?
practitioner?
Right, but for the owners, still trust and stuff still...
in their practice, yes. Trust companies. But there are strategies there where you might move from one to the other. PSI income for a practice owner is still there. PSI income for our doctors is still there. For the individual practitioners is still there. So you can't escape that. And again, this is where you're fighting sometimes against the misinformation that's out there that, I'm a personal services business and therefore I can split my income amongst family members. That's not true. And there's so many people out there that'll go, well, my accountant says I can. They're wrong, mate. At the end of the day, the tax office, when they catch you, is going to fine you for tax avoidance. Your practitioner is going to go, oh, well, sorry, I got that wrong. What are you going to do about that? And you're going to be the one that's on their radar. The rulings that have come out, the Queensland rulings come out for payroll tax now means that in Queensland, our GPs have to be sole trader individuals.
Well, let's just talk about this payroll tax. What do you foresee? I mean, 2 years ago where they said, well, the government said, we're going to give you amnesty if you didn't conform to payroll tax, you sign up for payroll tax, we'll give you this amnesty. And then all of a sudden we have different rules, different states are doing different things. What can we expect?
Payroll tax is a political football, which has become a political football. The noise that the GP industry has made has been a big, big factor in this, in that the GP space has made more noise than, say, the dentists or the specialists or the allied health practitioners, who this ruling also applies to. Mm-hmm. And you don't see anywhere near as the level of angst in those industries. However, by making all the noise, we turn the focus on ourselves as GP industry people. You will need to see, I think, a big focus, one, on the understanding of how payroll tax applies. It's a state-based tax. The rules in Queensland are now different to the rules in New South Wales, which are different to the rules in Victoria, which are different to the rules in South Australia. As a general concept, very general concept, disclaiming, if you are any of these states, come and get specific advice. Western Australia, Northern Territory and Tasmania are reasonably low-risk states. Queensland is also a reasonably low-risk state in that they've clearly spelled out to us what we need to do as an industry to achieve the mitigation, or they call it the avoidance of payroll tax applying. And that is to go through and have colloquially what's been called the flow of funds solution, where patient fees are now flowing to our doctors. Mm-hmm. And what this is taking away is the way that payroll tax is applied. We always have to start, though, with our service agreements. There are so many service agreements which start off drafted by non-industry professionals. They start off being drafted by practice managers. They start off being drafted as contractor agreements, and they're the wrong agreements. And that if you get that wrong, you're gone. Then you go through and say, okay, I get a right agreement drafted by an industry-specific solicitor who's out there known for doing this, which I can then rely on. Then the next step, and that's dealing with whether or not you're a contractor or for payroll tax purposes. The next step is, how is payroll tax calculated? And very generally, it's based on payments made by the medical practice, which is deemed as the employer, to the practitioner. And so the flow of funds solution, call it, is have the patient fees go to the practitioner with only the service fee coming back from the practitioner to the medical centre, which really reflects the true relationship of the arrangement, where the doctor is running their own business, and as a medical centre operator, you're providing serviced rooms for them to operate their practice, and they're paying you a fee for that. In that situation, it's quite clear if the doctor is being a sole trader, in Queensland at least, that is definitely not going to be subject to payroll tax. So subject to everything else and getting it signed off by your advisor. But in the other states, they've brought in this concept of the bulk billing, which is your level of bulk billing percentages will determine your liability to payroll tax. Now, that becomes a major issue from two things. One, it's a political thing. What they're doing there is making a situation where they want to see GPs as greedy.
So what do you mean by a level of bulk billing? So if you're like 60% bulk billing, 80% bulk billing, 90%?
It differs. So the level of bulk billing differs, and the legislation and the way it's going to apply is still coming through. So I can't give you a definitive answer at the moment. But the level, each state has gone through and said, if you've got this...
And that's based on this government?
That's based on the New South Wales government. It's based on the Victorian government.
But the present government that's in...
The present government in those particular states. You will find in each one of those states, the opposition, which tends to be the Liberal Party, have gone and said that they will potentially have a different position on this. And this
at
is
the next election?
At the next election. And so this is where it becomes a political football. And so what you're seeing is the college will lobby hard for this to be an election issue. And you saw the effect of this in Queensland when it first came in. The college went to the government and said, we're going to tell all our patients that the fees are going up because this is a tax grab from the state government. The state government said, well, no, let's put this all on hold and here's an amnesty and we don't have to do anything. But in the other states, you've gone through and said, well, they've taken the front foot and said, well, if you bulk bill, there won't be any payroll tax. And so they can now go through and say at the election time, the doctors are carrying on about not making enough money or making noise about not making enough money. But if they bulk bill, there's no tax here. But the doctors then have to say, well, if we bulk bill, we're not making any money and we can't provide this level of care. And so it becomes this whole political discussion.
But Paul, what about the current state? I mean, when you're paying those 70-30% share, the ratio between paying the doctor and the service fee, that already we just-in-time management, right? So, but what happens to the cash flow to practices?
The cash flow to practices, you shouldn't be collecting the patient fees in and
that
using
is
it
true,
anyway, right?
But forever and a day, it's always been this way, and a lot of practices have been set up that way,
which they shouldn't have been. So a lot of, our practices have always had the two bank account systems. Sure. So, but let's go through and say cash flow system. The cash flow can be alleviated by the money coming through, having some working capital in there. It's not, the cash flow to me is a short-term issue that we can move forward. The other issues we talk about, bulk billing, is the government trying to influence the way that doctors bill their patients.
It seems to me if they're talking about bulk billing percentages.
Yeah, exactly. But then you go through and say the whole idea of payroll tax is that...
Differentiating.
Not differentiating, but it's going through and saying, as a practitioner, I am operating independently of the practice. Now, if the practice can then come in and tell me how to bill my patients, it's actually emphasising more that the arrangement is subject to payroll tax. At the moment, you can go through and the practitioner sets the fees. The practitioner determines how much they're going to bill the patient. But if you as the practice owner put pressure on them to bulk bill these patients because you're worried about payroll tax, that can be a significant backfiring for you, because now you're able to influence the way they operate, the way they charge their patients. And in the situation there, they're more likely probably to be deemed as taxable wages.
So what would you say to general practice owners right now in Queensland, for example, or anywhere else in the state, in Australia? What should we be doing?
Queensland, you need to be moving towards the, as I said, call it the flow of funds solution. You need to start putting that in place. The technology is catching up. You have all your software, best practice, and so on is going through and moving to that solution, as well as your terminals such as Tyro, High Caps. Your other industry terminals are moving towards that. They allow the disbursement of money directly to the doctor's accounts, which is great. In the other states, we're still waiting on that clarity. What we've got is a band-aid which says, hey, in a lot of cases, payroll tax is not going to apply for a certain period. So New South Wales and Victoria, South Australia is now open from 1 July. But you go through and say, we've got moratoriums or we've got amnesty periods in place. Not necessarily amnesty periods, but pauses. Then you've got to go through and say the legislation's not there. So we don't know exactly what it's going to be.
And this is the biggest thing. We don't know what the legislation is at the moment.
It's still a bit of a wait and see. But the other big thing that's not being addressed is none of the states have definitively said that the flow of funds is actually out in those states. And so we're still thinking that there is options there, both with your agreements and with patient flow, to look at solutions there for payroll tax. But it's very much a watch this space.
Oh, awesome, Paul. Thanks for shedding light on that. Last but not least, just want to talk in general. What do you see in terms of AI getting into the industry? Well, it's there now. How do you see that affecting the operations? What's it doing in terms of accounting? Have you seen any changes there?
AI was a big topic at the Owner-Doctor Conference this year. I think we're just scratching the surface. I think we're going to see it coming more and more into the space. Like any new technology which is also moving into a new use within the industry, we're going to see a lot of evolution over time. We are getting initial feedback that the right use of AI is saving our doctors a lot of time. It can also, depending on how you use it, whether it's recording, conversations and so on, it can actually be potentially a good medico-legal tool in that in a lot of cases where things may happen, it could be a he said, or he said, she said, male patient, female doctor, somebody says I was examined inappropriately or in the wrong way. If we've got a recording of the conversation or of what was in the room, that could shed a lot of light on that for us. But whether or not the technology is there. But then you go through and say
confidentiality and all of that.
Confidentiality and everything like that, and letting people know that it's being recorded. The recording of our notes at the end, I think, is already happening through. How that is working is still an evolution in progress. I think it is something that younger doctors coming through will start thinking of, okay, well, how's this practice adopting AI? And they're looking for that. They're looking for the use of technology. They're looking for the use of efficiencies, as opposed to some of our older doctors who may naturally fear the change.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming over.
No worries.
It's forever evolving. There's always changes, but it's good having these conversations and shedding light on the different aspects of general practice, especially the financial aspect and the commercial aspect of it. So for all those listeners out there that want to know more about Paul and the services that he provides, the information will be in the description. And from me and from everybody here at MedCenters TV, I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope it was as good for you as it was for me. And we'll see you next time on another valued episode of MedCenters TV. Bye for now.